So do you want to start the process, Laura? Okay. All right. Welcome and to another Author on the Hill book talk. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mark Shelton, and I am the Director of Library Services here at the College of the Holy Cross. Thank you for joining us today. Obviously, in a normal world, we'd be gathered together and dine in library, but today we are exploring the world of book talks in the virtual environment. I just want to touch on a few things before we get started. First, today's talk is being recorded, and it will be posted to the library's YouTube account as soon as it's processed, probably in the next day or two. If you miss anything because your family or your pet interrupts you, please know that you'll be able to watch what you missed at your convenience. Next, recognize that you are muted so that we can all focus on the talk. If appropriate, we will unmute you. Third, if you have questions, because we will have a Q&A session at the end of the talk, please post your questions in the chat and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. So let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our author on the Hill today, Professor Alvaro Jarrín. He's an associate professor in the Sociology and Anthropology department here at Holy Cross. Professor Jarrín, a graduate of Williams College, holds a master's and a PhD in cultural anthropology from Duke University. Having arrived at Holy Cross in 2014 from Union College, he was made associate professor of anthropology in 2019. Today, we are honored to have Professor Jarrín speak about his Marisa Navarro book award-winning title, The Biopolitics of Beauty, Cosmetic Citizenship and Effective Capital in Brazil, published by the University of California Press in 2017. I turn it over to you, Professor Jarrín.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out on these online times. I know we're all suffering from Zoom fatigue, so the fact that you came out to get a bit more Zoom this week, I really appreciate it. It's my pleasure to talk about my work. Let me share my screen. So the title of my book is The Biopolitics of Beauty, Cosmetic Citizenship and Effective Capital in Brazil. And I know anthropologists love to use weird theoretical terms, but hopefully it makes sense once I explain it. The central aspect that my book explored was the fact that in Brazil, plastic surgery has been available to low-income patients since the 1960s in publicly funded hospitals, either public hospitals or hospitals that have some sort of public funding behind them, like philanthropic hospitals. Plastic surgeons in general are lauded for their work. I'm a bit more critical of why they're doing this. And it's pretty unique. Brazil is one of the few countries in the world that offers plastic surgery, aesthetic surgery in particular, to low-income patients, right? To patients that use the public healthcare system. Brazil has an amazing healthcare system, a public healthcare system that unfortunately has also been defunded throughout the years, and it's really struggling right now with COVID. And I'd be happy to answer questions about that later. But I'll talk about plastic surgery mostly today. So a very famous surgeon called Ivo Pitangui popularized this idea that the poor should be provided what he called the right to beauty. And he published a book called The Right to Beauty. And he thought of it as a way to uplift them and include them in the nation, right? So beautification for him was not simply an individual project, right? Or a charity project, although it was sort of framed as a charity project. For him, it was about improving the nation, right? So that's why I call this a biopolitical project. For those who haven't heard the term biopolitics, Michel Foucault, a philosopher, argued that, that medicine in particular could be used to gain power over life. So he said, medicine becomes basically a form of politics in certain aspects, and has been part of eugenics projects around the world. He would say that's part of biopolitics, right? And I was really interested in how beauty has become a biopolitical project in Brazil. On the other hand, I also think of beauty as an effective process in the sense that the working class patients are not dupes, they're simply imbibing this discourse of becoming beautiful, they actually have very embodied, effective responses to what they in fact call the dictatorship of beauty. They're kind of critical about the very system of beauty that they're participating in. And they specifically tie it to their class, race, and gender inequalities in Brazil, right? So the inequalities, bodily inequalities that they suffer. So I began to see beauty as somehow condensing those bodily inequalities in a very interesting way. And I argue that's why beauty is so important in Brazil. But let me start with biopolitics, right? The more top-down side, why the surgeons decided to do this. So this is the Ivo Pitangui Institute. This is the place where it started in the 60s. Now almost all public hospitals offer this. But it started here. It's still a very popular place, right? So people go in, they start doing lines, right? So forming lines outside of the center at like 5 a.m. in order to get a queue, right? Sort of number so that they can get a consultation with a medical resident and hopefully get a surgery, which is not completely free. It's low cost in this particular institute. And they mostly were very thankful. They would always talk about how Ivo Pitangui was a wonderful person for making beauty available to people that don't normally have access to beauty. The surgeons, however, think of these populations apt for study and for knowledge production, right? In fact, when I was initially doing research, I was thinking of more doing about cosmetic tourists, right? So Europeans and Americans that go to Brazil for plastic surgery. And it was the plastic surgeons themselves who told me, like, no, that would violate some patient confidentiality. But why don't you study the people that basically we study in the public hospitals? And that's how I found out about the public hospitals offering plastic surgery to the poor. So when you look at the reasons why you were doing this, I was initially very confused. Eugenics kept coming up, right? So for example, in 2009, I interviewed a plastic surgeon who prides himself of having produced several Miss Brazil winners through plastic surgery. And he told me the following. He said, miscegenation improved the eugenic condition of the population, and beautification techniques aid eugenics because they help people remain youthful and improve themselves. So for him, miscegenation, racial mixture, right, was something that led to a eugenic condition, a good population, and beautification complements that work. When he told me this, I was kind of flabbergasted. I was really surprised that in the 21st century, a plastic surgeon would sort of take eugenics as a serious project, right? Because in other contexts, eugenics has been thoroughly delegitimized as a truthful science, right? We now think of it as part of scientific racism, right? And it led to, right, Nazi Germany, right? There's very reasons why we decided that eugenics was not a good project anymore to do. And yet in Brazil, it doesn't seem to have completely lost its value among plastic surgeons in particular. Ivo Pitangui himself said that beauty is equivalent to the search for eugenesis in the 1960s. And José Rebelo Neto, who is considered the father of Brazilian plastic surgery, he opened the very first plastic surgery practice in Brazil, argued that his medical practice works in favor of an ideal of beauty, hygiene, and eugenics. So I found it throughout the writings of plastic surgeons across the years, the further I went back in time. So why eugenics? How did eugenics become tied to beauty, right? Sort of seems confusing. What I argue is that the neo-Lamarckian type of eugenics that is very popular in Latin America is a response to the more negative kind of eugenics that was very popular in Europe, right? So for example, in 1874, French Count de Gobineau, who had been an ambassador to Brazil, said that Brazilians are a completely mulatto population, polluted in the blood and the spirit, and frighteningly ugly, right? So the basis of the racism that Europeans espoused was that sort of racial mixture would lead to ugly, right, polluted people, right? In response, Brazilians didn't say, you're wrong that there's racial hierarchies. They still embrace racial hierarchies, right? It was mostly a white intelligentsia, right? The white elites in Brazil were still in control, right? But they argued that racial mixture was actually would lead to eugenics, right? So their answer was racial mixture is actually a good thing because it weeds out the polluted elements of society. So for example, Alvaro Peixoto, who's a Brazilian intellectual, lawyer, doctor, said that not only is the Brazilian population growing enormously, but racial mixture is also increasing. Pure blacks do not exist anymore. Mestizos disappear, either because they die prematurely or because they interbreed with whiter elements. Thus, the race widens. In Brazil, the great race, which has assimilated and depurated the other two races, and desirable only due to their uncultured condition and ugliness, is the white race, right? So they both this French intellectual and this Brazilian intellectual agree that, right, non-white races are ugly. But according to the Brazilian intellectual, right, this is not destiny. He argues that through eugenics, they're going to somehow get rid of the non-white elements in society over time through miscegenation, through racial mixture. And this explains why until today, Brazil thinks of itself as a country that values racial mixture, right? Other examples, right? The eugenicist and sexologist Hernani de Aja publishes a book called The Morphology of Woman in 1931, which says that certain types of women are more robust and ideal for reproduction. And he actually, this is an actual picture from his book that shows that a Black woman plus an indigenous woman plus a white man equals a quote unquote beautiful Brazilian woman, right? So he actually thought the racial mixture between, but always between white men and non-white women would produce more beautiful Brazilians, right? And he felt that sort of these quote unquote, he called them lower types, these non-white women could be basically redeemed, right, for the nation through reproduction. Beauty was also thought of as racial progress. So Renato Kelho was the founder of the Eugenic Society of Sao Paulo, wrote a book called The Cure of Ugliness in 1923 that said that ugliness was only the product of degeneration and disease, and if they introduced hygiene and eugenic practices into the country, beauty would ensue. And he dedicated a whole chapter to plastic surgery, right? Saying how, you know, these women with deformed noses would now get their noses transformed into Greek or Roman style, right? So always looking into European ideals of beauty as sort of the best, right? That's things that Brazilians wanted for themselves. This sort of, right, lingers, right? So what I argue is that among plastic surgeons in particular, they've inherited this eugenic ideals of what beauty does, right? Because it sort of reinforces the idea that they're really great for the nation. Plastic surgeons have very high self-esteem in Brazil and keep talking about how plastic surgery is the best medical discipline that Brazil has produced, right? And they are sort of, for reasons I will talk later, they are sort of knowledge producers per excellence around the world, and Brazil is a center of knowledge production of plastic surgery. So the plastic surgeons are super proud, right? And they say, we're saving the nation basically from itself through beauty. When I asked a group of plastic surgeons at a conference why plastic surgery hadn't so much appeal in Brazil, they argued that it made white women desire the buttocks and breasts of Black women, while everyone else desires European noses, right? So they sort of see it as creating this middle, right, of a mixture in some ways. But it's interesting that the body, right, sort of the body that is sexualized and racialized in particular ways is thought of as being blackened by plastic surgery, while the face, which is a site of authority, right, and a site of recognition, is always whitened, right? And I argue that's part of the hierarchy that's going on, that's sort of reinforced in plastic surgery. A surgeon that specifically was doing surgery, a nose surgery on a teenager. When I asked her why she was getting the surgery, she just said, you know, I have a flat, thick nose that I don't like, right? That's the word that a lot of people use in Brazil to describe sort of Black noses of Black origin, right? But the surgeon used a very technical term. He used the Negroid nose, which shows how much they medicalize the Black body as something that needs correction, right? So he said, this girl has the typical Brazilian beauty except for the nose. She is morena, brown, a product of miscegenation, of racial mixture. She wanted to correct not only the shape, but also reduce the width of the nostrils, but it would create a scar and appear artificial. The Negroid nose is very common in the Brazilian race. So this is how they talk about, and this is very common, this is how they talk about how Black noses in Brazil and Black features in general as something that needs to be excised, right, or corrected. This particular picture is from an academic article that talks about Negroes published by Brazilian surgeons on the quote unquote Negroid nose, right? I want you to notice sort of the stereotypical kind of caricature that this woman is being compared to, right? This article told you the exact angles that sort of define a nose as being a quote unquote Negroid nose. They do anthropometric analysis of these angles and measurements. And the article, interestingly enough, didn't show the sort of correction of her nose, right? In some ways, the article seemed to imply that her nose was beyond redeeming in some kind of ways, right? Instead, they showed a Morena patient, a slightly lighter skinned patient or a Brazilian patient, and they showed the before and after pictures of the nose job and how it created a thinner nose and how you go about it. And they described in detail the surgery necessary to go about it, right? But it's always thought of as a correction of basically a deformity, right? When I talked to medical residents that were specializing in plastic surgery, they always brought up race. So I was actually, when I was starting this project, I expected gender to be more central to why surgeons would think surgery was important, but they always brought up race. It was so central to them. This medical resident in particular said, the mixture of races in Brazil left a lot of people with the wrong nose or ear. That is why people do surgery, to look like those beautiful people that mixed less, like the models Gisele Bündchen and Daniela Sicarelli that are pictured here. Sometimes whole families undergo nose surgery so that they do not have their father's nose, right? So again and again, surgeons would bring up white supermodels, white actresses, right, as the ideals of beauty that they said mix less and somehow were more closer to beauty ideals, or people that mix too much were thought of as bad, right? But of course, a very Black woman wouldn't be considered an ideal, right? So there was a very strong racial hierarchy in the minds of these plastic surgeons, most of whom were male, most of whom were white, right? They're part of the elite in Brazil. And I argue that that's part of the reason why they're reinforcing these racial stereotypes, because it reinforces the preconceptions of what is beautiful, right? That is central to Brazil's racial hierarchy. Let me now turn to affect, right? Because we've talked a lot about surgeons, but this doesn't mean that the patients necessarily just imbibe this and consume it uncritically, right? Beauty is experienced effectively by patients, right? Affect theory is a very interesting theory that I found super useful. It's become more popular in anthropology, right? And it's kind of this interesting idea William Mazzarella puts in this way. He says that affect gets at the way in which society is inscribed in our nervous system and in our flesh before it appears in our consciousness, right? So there's this idea that culture becomes so visceral that you sort of just, without thinking about it, you sort of do culture, right? And sort of react to society in particular ways. Brian Masumi argues that those visceral reactions to the world may seem instinctual, but they're actually shaped by affective forms of cognition, right? That in some ways go beyond just discourse and language, right? So it's kind of a very interesting concept. Sarah Ahmed argues that affect gets at sort of the relations between people, right? And argue the relational aspects of beauty, right? She argues that affect circulates through the body politic and sticks to certain bodies, imparting positive or negative value at the level of perception, right? So she says when you look at someone in society, you immediately attach positive or negative values depending on stereotypes you have in your head socially, right? So for example, she gives the example of the turban, right? In Western society, she says after 9/11, the turban, even though it's mostly associated with the Sikhs, not with people who are Muslim, it still causes Islamophobia. It causes xenophobia for people who wear turbans because of its association with Islam, right? So she argues that it becomes this kind of, again, visceral reaction of hatred towards people, right? And it's just trying to explain why xenophobia and Islamophobia happen in society. So I apply that to that sort of conception to beauty. And I argue that, yes, there's this very intense aesthetic hierarchy of beauty in Brazil, where beauty and ugliness are at the opposite poles. And it condenses race, class, and gender inequalities. And I tried to make a graph, right? Graphs are always two-dimensional, so this is not, I'm not gonna say that it can be reduced to simply this graph, because nothing is just two-dimensional. It's more complex than this. But in general, beauty is associated with whiteness, with gender normativity, and with wealth, while blackness in Brazilian society is associated with blackness, ugliness is associated with blackness, gender variance, and poverty, right? And in general, right, there's a difference between how face is constructed versus the body. So let's start with each axis. Let's start with race, right, with whiteness. How did whiteness become a norm thought of as beautiful, right? Not only is there that biopolitical background, right? But when I talk to surgeons, to plastic surgery patients themselves, right? they talked about these interesting racial norms, right, that were sort of embedded in their cultural practices. So Rosa, who was a Brazilian of Lebanese descent, had her first surgery when she was 15 years old, a nose job paid by her father. And she said every woman in her family, but it's interesting, only the women, not the men, only the women in their family automatically got the surgery when they turned 15. It was their 15-year-old quinceañera present, basically, right? And she said that that surgery was necessary for the women in her family who had larger noses because they were of Middle Eastern descent to fit into the quote-unquote national beauty standard. A teenager I talked to, Beatriz, underwent ear surgery like her parents before her because friends at school had always teased her and they called her macaca or monkey, which in Brazil is macaca is also used as a racial epithet against Afro-Brazilians. And even though she herself was white, there was clear that sort of this racial epithet was sort of really traumatized her and she wanted to do something about it through surgery. She also said that her ears gave her the face of a bad person, which is kind of interesting because it ties to this long-standing sort of criminological kind of stereotypes that certain appearance, sort of physical appearances are tied with criminality and some are not, right? Which are tied to, again, to racism, like Lombroso's criminology theory and stuff like that from Italy. So it's a very interesting how these old stereotypes get embedded in the present. When it comes to Blackness, right, Black women are valued in Brazil, but only during Carnival, right? So this is a Globeleza. Every year, they finally stopped doing this, but every year, the most powerful TV network in Brazil, TV Globo, chooses mulata, sort of racially mixed Black woman to represent sort of beauty in Brazil, right? And then she parades kind of naked in these vignettes that celebrate Carnival. But it's interesting because she very rarely has a voice. She's just like that dancing kind of mulata figure. And when I talk to patients, particularly middle and upper class patients in Brazil, they distance themselves from that kind of beauty, right? So for example, Ligia, who was a middle class white woman, said, mulatas become too muscular when they work out. They already have bodies like that naturally and then end up with six-pack abs and legs that are too muscular. It's not pretty. People who are dark skinned cannot get plastic surgery anyway, right? They end up with keloids. The result is not as good, right? So she was telling me this because she herself wasn't going to undergo plastic surgery. It wasn't the first one, it was the third surgery she was getting. She thought of it as a way of improving herself throughout her life. A lot of middle-class women in Brazil think of that. But Ligia thought that the main thing she said was that for her, the beauty of the mulatto was a beauty that was not for her, a beauty that was very different from her, and she even thought that Black people can get plastic surgery, right? So she distanced herself from Blackness in a very interesting way. Another interesting interview I did was with Julia, who brought her 10-year-old grandson for ear surgery. And it's interesting that ear surgeries are racialized in Brazil. You wouldn't think they are. And he said, she said, people have plastic surgery done so they are not different from others, to feel included in their social group, to not have those ears, that nose, those lips that cause suffering. Boa aparência, good appearance, is important to be successful in the job market. People who say that it's not the case are just saying that outwardly, but think differently. For all professions, appearance is important, very much so, right? So she specifically thought that the future of her grandchild, who was only 10 at the time, depended on this plastic surgery that would sort of fix his ears, right? Make them less prominent in his face. And even though she was working class, she would be bringing her grandchild to a public hospital to get this kind of surgery. So race kind of was embedded in a lot of different discourses that sort of plastic surgery patients used. But at the same time, they were able to criticize the racism in Brazil at the same time that they were sometimes sort of willingly undergoing in these surgeries. The second axis is gender, right? Plastic surgery is absolutely thought of as a feminine practice in Brazil. It's very acceptable for women to get plastic surgeries. I never had problem getting women to talk to me about these surgeries. The women receive approval also very easily in the public hospitals, and lack of femininity is medicalized as an issue, right? So for example, I remember a teenager who had very small breasts came to the hospital, and she and her mother just talked about it as like, I feel inadequate because my breasts are smaller compared to all my classmates. But the surgeon had to justify it in the eyes of the state and the eyes of the hospital. So he had to label it But he also had to sort of justify it medically, and he said he labeled it as hypertrophy of the mammary glands. He gave it this kind of fancy term, which allowed to medicalize it in a way that, again, justified it. And it actually sort of reinforced for these two women, right, the teenager and her mom, that she had a condition that needed curing, as opposed to, right, telling them, well, bodies come in all shapes and sizes, right? These women, the women that I talked to in public hospitals tied feminine biological processes like giving birth and breastfeeding to necessary repairs, right? So they always made these plans, and they would say, well, after I give birth, after I stop breastfeeding, I will need a tummy tuck, I may need a breast lift. So they made these interesting plans, and they would always say, this is not, to me, this is not simply about vanity, this is about repairing my body after it's gone through labor, literally, right? And they actually talked about them as a form of leisure and self-care, which really surprised me. I remember a woman who was a domestic worker, right? So she always worked for others, cleaning other people's homes. So she told me, then I would go home and I had to clean my home and cook for my kids, right? So she has this kind of really intense work life. And she told me that plastic surgery for her was this, she kind of dreamed about it, because she was like, for the first time, other people are going to have to take care of me. My husband and my kids and are going to have to take care of me, and I'm going to have to rest for 2 weeks. And for her, it was like basically like a mini vacation, a form of leisure to get the surgery, which is really, really interesting in a lot of ways. Men, on the other hand, are not thought of as the ideal candidates for plastic surgery. The only acceptable surgeries are those that remasculinize the male body, right? So for example, gynecomastia is a surgery to sort of get rid of too much fatty tissue on the chest, right, to define it more clearly. This particular patient is getting a surgery that will help liposuction in order to get a more defined six-pack. So that seems okay from the eyes of the surgeons. But these public hospitals in particular have psychologists that weed out problem patients that they think will make issues, complain, but they also weeded out male patients that they thought were inappropriately getting surgery. So for example, I remember the psychologist saying that a man who wanted a facelift shouldn't be allowed to have one because it made him probably a homosexual, right? So she used this kind of homophobic language to exclude him from getting a facelift. It's even worse for trans-identified patients, right? Trans-identified patients that would come to the public hospitals to try to get some kind of gender affirmation surgery were just laughed out of the practice, basically, right? In very cruel ways, in fact. So I noticed very quickly that the plastic surgeons and their psychologists, right, all the people that are involved in this in public hospitals are very invested in the gender binary. They just want to remasculinize male bodies, feminize female bodies, and that's pretty much it, right? Then let's go to class, right? In fact, class in some ways is, I think, the key, right, that brings all of these together. Patients described ugliness as the product of living a hard life, right? They said that ugliness, it was a source of suffering and abjection, of kind of a form of social death almost. I was struck by a patient that told me that being ugly made her feel incredibly ashamed. And she said, it's as if I was the living dead, right? On the other hand, patients always talked about beauty opening doors. It's a very common, popular saying in Brazil, beauty opens doors. And working class patients experience beauty as a form of lack, right? They thought of beauty as something that the people with money always have. They would say, like, people with money can go to the gym and they can eat well and they can do all these things, but I cannot, right? I have to work all the time. I don't have time to go to the gym or money to go to the gym. I don't have access to healthy food. So therefore, plastic surgery was kind of a catch-up, right? I can catch up to some of the beauty standards that they have in Brazil. And they thought of it as basically as a form of capital, right? Beauty is a form of capital. Wealth is thought of as giving beauty, right? Samara once told me there are really no ugly people, only poor people. And when I asked her to explain, what do you mean by that? There's no ugly people, only poor people. She said, I believe there are social classes where there are more beautiful people. I believe that the more money that you have, the greater the probability that you are more beautiful for various reasons. You eat better, you lead a better life, you can get plastic surgery. Of course, there are beautiful poor people and very ugly rich people, but most rich people I see are beautiful, and when they are not naturally beautiful, they make themselves beautiful. So there's this idea that you can buy beauty, right? So while in other parts in the world, right, we are very concerned with natural beauty, right? In Brazil, it's sort of the sense is that beauty is something that can always be accessed. It's another consumer good that can be accessed and should be accessed if you can afford it, right? It's almost irresponsible for you to not to do it if you can afford it, or you get access to it through a public hospital. The other thing is opposite is also true. Beauty is thought of as providing wealth because it's a form of capital. It can be transformed into economic wealth. So in popular culture, novels, soap operas, beauty contests, beauty reality TV shows, there's these narratives that say that beauty gives people upward mobility in some way or another, because you either marry up or you get discovered as a model or you get a job opportunity, right? Beauty is supposed to lift people, particularly women, out of poverty. There was a particular TV show, a reality TV show called Beauty in the Favela, that would go to these low-income communities in Brazil, and they would discover, right, women that they thought were beautiful. But it's interesting because they would send Sao Paulo modeling agents, most of them whom were white, and basically they would discover whoever was lighter skinned and tall and had straight hair, right? Sort of like what they thought was beautiful in a favela, right? In a poor community, and then sort of bring her to do this reality contest, and they would sort of, have a fashion show, a pageant show, but with all these women from poor communities. A presenter sort of gave away how he thought about it. In the finality of Beauty in the Favela, he said, winning beauty in the favela is not simply about winning a beauty contest. It is defeating prejudice, defeating the difficulties and obstacles, defeating social difference. Brazil is a country that has in its most impoverished communities great values, great talents that only need to be discovered. This is the Midas touch of our program, right? Through the reporters who went forth and made their discoveries. So they think of themselves as discovering this kind of raw talent, right? But again, discovering a very specific type of beauty. They never asked people in favelas what they thought was beautiful, which in fact is more racially diverse, not surprisingly. And they thought of it as, again, sort of something that would defeat prejudice and defeat difficulties and obstacles and social difference, and very different from thinking like, let's try to, provide free education to these women so that they can find a career, right? It was not about that. It was that beauty was supposed to lift them out of poverty. A lot of favelas, I did fieldwork in a lot of favelas where they themselves sort of buy into this ideology and have created modeling schools. So for example, in the City of God, which is Cidade de Deus, is a famous favela. You might have heard of it because there's a famous film about the violence in it. And one particular person who lives in this community created a modeling school called Dreamlands. And he talked about it as fashion in the service of citizenship. So he would teach these young women and some men to become models, and they would sort of do like fashion shows in sort of the streets of the favela and sort of teach them how to do makeup and photography, right? And he would take these fashion photographs of the models with the idea that it would help them, right? He believed, and a lot of the women believed, that this would somehow take them out of poverty, right? They were learning by learning how to do beauty, they were learning a basic good, right? And a form of economic wealth and generations. So why is beauty so tied to hope? An anthropologist, Kassan Hage, argues that any society has the capacity to produce and distribute hope amongst its members. It's one of the basic things that any state should do. But late capitalist society does it in very unequal fashion, right? You either identify with a state project, right? Or you get the illusion of upward mobility. So he says, despite the massive inequalities on which capitalism depends, as long as individuals believe that there's some magical way that they can remain hopeful and attain upward mobility, right? In the US would be the American dream and sort of that myth, then people will keep playing the game, right? In Brazil, I argue that beauty has become that magical value, particularly for women, right? Lower income women. Beauty is thought of as the way that's going to sort of guarantee them some sort of upward mobility in a country that has very little upward mobility, right? Upward mobility in Brazil is very hard to come by in general, right? No matter how hard you work. So that's one of the reasons why beauty is thought of as this thing that magically, and every once in a while it does, right? So Gisele Bündchen was a famous supermodel, wife of Tom Brady, one of the most richest women in Brazil. She, right, came from a working class background. She got discovered as a model, and then she became a supermodel around the world. She became very wealthy, right? So because every once in a while it happens, hope is really tied to beauty for a lot of these women. The catch, right? So you're probably wondering what surgeons, aside from their own self-worth and thinking of themselves as very charitable people, what do they get out of offering plastic surgery to low-income patients in public hospitals? The catch is that these patients are experimental subjects for medical residents that are still in training, right? And the patients are perfectly aware that this is the case, but because beauty has such value in Brazil, they would tell me, of course I know I'm a guinea pig, and they would use the word guinea pig, cobaia, but they said, the risk of ugliness is higher. I remember one particular patient saying, I know they're studying me, but I don't care. I wouldn't have a way to pay otherwise, right? And I argue that surgeons externalize the cost of surgery onto the working class patients. So they would always blame the patients whenever something went wrong, and it happens, right? Surgery is a risky endeavor. And when something bad would happen, the plastic surgeons and their medical residents would always say, well, the patient didn't rest enough. The patient didn't prepare for the surgery. The patient this, the patient that. At the same time that they themselves were favoring riskier procedures that promised them to alter bodies more easily, right? In the book, I give the example of bioplasty. So bioplasty is a particular application of polymethyl methacrylate, a compound that's basically akin to acrylic glass. It's very close to acrylic glass. And that it has some medical uses. In the United States, it's used, for example, for certain teeth, right? For enamel, for certain bone implants, right? But in Brazil, they decided it was an aesthetic application, and they injected into people's bodies in order to transform the bodies. And it's basically a permanent transformation of the body, because unlike Botox, which sort of the body absorbs, right? And sort of eventually it gets rid of it, bioplasty is permanent. And it basically they put it between the bone and the muscle in ways that actually do reshape people's faces in very strange ways and people's bodies, right? The next picture, I'm sorry, it's kind of shocking. This is a picture of when it goes wrong. So this is a woman who had a bad rejection. So every once in a while, right? Again, we don't have the exact numbers because plastic surgeons don't want to sort of fess up, but once every few thousand cases, somebody had a complete rejection of this compound, and their body would literally start having necrosis, right? Like their body literally started rotting from these applications. And I go to a conference that was tackling this topic, and there was a whole panel just dedicated to defending bioplasty. Plastic surgeons said that the bioplasty was a phenomenal weapon that aesthetic medicine possesses, a dream of defeating all afflictions by completely modifying bodily structures, right? So he sort of is like, it's so amazing, it's so powerful that we can't say no to it. And yes, some people have awful reactions, but we're gonna keep doing it. And the legal system in Brazil makes it very, very hard for patients, particularly working class patients, to really sue the surgeons whenever something goes wrong. In fact, because they're thought of as charity cases, the legal system doesn't defend them at all. Private clinic patients are much more likely to be successful, but even then, even private patients at most just win the cost of the surgery back. They don't win huge damages like in the United States, so it's very hard for them to get much out of suing a doctor. But what struck me the most was that these surgeons dismissed adverse reactions to bioplasty or PMMA as caused by improper applications, right? So they would always say that particular surgeon didn't know how to do it, right? As opposed to admitting that the technique itself was inherently dangerous. What attracts me to bioplasty is that it gets exported around the world. So once Brazil produces a particular technique and it gets accepted as scientific truth in Brazil, it gets exported to other places. So for example, this is a particular ad from Miraflores in Peru. This is an ad from Medellin, Colombia, advertising bioplasty, right? I'm absolutely sure that these plastic surgeons who had advertising this learned it in Brazil, because Brazil is the center in Latin America for learning plastic surgery, but I saw also European and American surgeons going to Brazil to learn plastic surgery techniques that they would develop there. I remember an American surgeon complaining, well, the FDA makes it so hard to approve new techniques in the United States, but in Brazil, they approve everything. And that's basically the truth, right? There's a huge level of leniency towards new experimental techniques that can make these plastic surgeons incredibly wealthy, right? So a lot of them own stocks in the laboratory that produces bioplasty and then exports it around Latin America. So there's a lot of money behind this, but at the same time, there's a lot of risk for patients. And not only are the techniques exported, the racial ideologies of beauty are exported. So I remember going to a plastic surgery conference, and a plastic surgeon from Bolivia who had learned to do plastic surgery in Brazil, and she went back to Bolivia. She came back to Brazil to give a conference paper about the Andean nose, and she literally compared it to the Negroid nose, and she said, just like in Brazil you have the Negroid nose, this problem that needs to be corrected through surgery, I have discovered the correction of an Andean nose. And she put the picture of former President Evo Morales on the screen, and she said, this is the type of nose we need to fix. And so I find it very ironic, right, that a mestizo plastic surgeon was sort of specifically using, right, the first indigenous president in Latin America as somebody that needed correction, right, as a nose that needed correction, right, really excised from the nation literally, which is interesting because then Bolivia had a coup to get rid of him, right? So there's a very interesting political dimensions to beauty. That's the central aspect of my argument. But I also want to figure out why it's so attractive to patients. But that's enough talking on my side. I would love to hear what you think. Questions, comments?
All right. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. If you have questions, please post them in the chat. And while we wait for people to post questions, I see lots of hand clapping out there. So that's a very positive reaction to your presentation and your talk. So while we wait for questions, I will pose a couple that is on my mind. So you talk about beauty driving wealth or wealth coming from beauty. Has there been any research on the extent to which people, or what percentage of people, have actually changed their socioeconomic status as a result of having had plastic surgery?
Yeah, I think it's more, it's a strong cultural belief that people have. I really doubt it actually provides people much upward mobility, right? Every once in a while, right, you have a supermodel that really came from poverty and became at all very popular. But it's interesting because it's just a sign of a magical thinking in some kind of ways. For men, it's soccer, right? So yes, a few soccer players in Brazil get discovered and go to these amazing European teams that make millions of dollars, even if they came from poverty. But most people who play soccer in Brazil don't gain upward mobility through that, right? It's not a viable bet. And yet everybody's betting on this, and it's sort of like playing the lottery and thinking that, but you have the quality to do it. So it's very tricky, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And are there, is the utilization of the service relatively universal across all communities? Or are there specific communities or towns in Brazil that have a tendency to have a higher percentage of the population having plastic surgery?
I mean, it's definitely more popular in the southeast and the south of Brazil, although it's starting to happen in the northeast in Brazil, right? So the northeast and the north are poor areas that have just more rundown medical systems. So I think people are not, plastic surgery is not as much of a priority in those areas. But in all big cities, plastic surgery is very popular. I think it's less popular in rural areas as well.
Okay, so we do have a couple of questions that have come in. The first one's from Jonathan Mulrooney. What are the primary counters to this ideology? Are there movements against this from the church, feminist groups, etc.? In a related way, I wonder about the prominence of Black Brazilians in sports. Is Pele or Neymar considered ugly or are they exceptions because men wealthy, etc.?
So great question. I didn't see anything from the church. Actually, I did see. I remember there was an evangelical kind of pastor that did publish a book against sort of beautification and sort of talked about it as a kind of sinful. So there's that kind of side. Black feminist groups have been at the forefront of this. Black feminist groups have written, right? They do blogs and sort of are active, and they are the ones that are calling out plastic surgeons basically as racist, right? And saying the fact that you're calling the Negro something that needs correction is just wrong, and this is the problem. So there is definitely a strong feminist, but small group of people, right? That sort of is trying to sort of counter what plastic surgeons are saying, but unfortunately plastic surgeons have much more attention from the media, for example, positive attention in some ways, right? So it's definitely an uphill battle. In terms of Pelé or Neymar, right? So it's interesting that they themselves are not talked of necessarily as attractive or unattractive, but there's a lot of attention to the women that they marry. And in fact, both Pelé and Neymar, right, sort of had most of their sexual partners and sort of women that they married were lighter skinned women. So people have accused them of participating in this eugenics inspired idea of sort of widening the race by marrying whiter women. So there's that tendency, right? And there was this controversy over Neymar even denying that he was black, right? So somebody asked him, what's the experience of being a black man in soccer? And he said, I'm not black, right? So there's these interesting ways in which these soccer players sometimes participate in racial ideologies.
Hmm. So there's a follow-up question related to Jonathan's comment. And she asks, can women in positions of power counter this? Or are they in power because they have had surgery?
So Dilma Rousseff, the only female president that Brazil has had until now, had a facelift before she ran for office, and it was a very public kind of, there was comments about how good her surgery was, which is interesting. And the other thing she did while in power is she, in order to respond to an epidemic of physical violence, domestic violence against women, she passed a law. She sort of urged Congress to pass a law and help pass a law that would provide plastic surgery for women who had basically been deformed through domestic violence. And I critique her in my book. I say that's literally an aesthetic, right, way of covering up the roots of domestic violence and the fact that the violence should be stopped, right? It shouldn't be just given plastic surgery. So unfortunately, women in power haven't been very critical of plastic surgery, and in fact have engaged in it, which is interesting. And there's a lot of male politicians as well that have engaged in facelifts and stuff like that. I think politicians in the US do too. They're not open about it because there's stigma in the US, right? It's the plastic surgery associated with vanity. Well, I'm pretty sure Biden had a facelift before he ran for office, right? But in the US, we hide it, which is interesting while people in Brazil talk about it because it's a form of capital.
As another question Anne had, does this idea of beauty and youth carry to approaches to the birth experience itself? For example, is cesarean section more normalized?
Yeah, great question. Yes, Brazil is one of the countries in the world that has the highest number of C-sections, in part because there's a strong cultural belief that natural birth will, quote unquote, deform a woman, while a C-section is thought of as again, tied to it's surgical, so it's tied to a form of capital. It's thought of as a middle upper class procedure. So even in public hospitals, there's a huge demand. There's also a lot of they schedule C-sections, right, for a specific date. So it also implies, makes your body more flexible. You can schedule your surgery for a particular day. You don't have to wait until your body goes into labor. So yeah, but C-sections are very, very popular in Brazil. So I think they are one of the countries of the world that has the highest rates.
Excellent. So Janice asked several questions. I'm interested in how this factors into reproduction and whether there's a story here about men feeling misled by women that have had surgically found beauty, but not transparent and honest about it, and then produce ugly babies.
Yeah.
She goes on to say, I remember reading years ago about a Chinese man that sued his wife for lying about having plastic surgery prior to their relationship and thus being misled.
There's a huge pressure on women to produce beautiful babies. There's a very good book about this if you're interested. Elizabeth Hodge Freeman published a book called The Color of Love that talks about the pressure that women have to having beautiful babies and the pressure that kids feel about sort of performing, right, being beautiful enough to be valued by their own families. And she talks about sort of darker skinned siblings being treated worse by their own parents than lighter skinned siblings. So it's pretty sad. But yeah, she talks about this huge pressure, right? So yeah, plastic surgery. But it's interesting because people talk so openly about the plastic surgeries that it's unlikely a woman would necessarily hide what she had done. But yeah, there's the sense that then it's a genetic lottery, right? You don't know what your kid is going to get, right? You're obviously not inheriting the surgery you got. So in a lot of families, it's true that the surgery itself is inherited. There's this understanding, well, I had a nose job, my child was going to have the same nose job probably at some point in their lives. So people plan ahead, and they even encourage, right, teenagers to think about, well, maybe it's time you fix this kind of thing.
So it would be interesting to see what happens with CRISPR and how CRISPR might impact some of this, depending on what the bioethics are in Brazil, as that technology increases and the ability to identify things so that possibly children are already born with these modifications.
Yeah, I'm very worried because in other countries, in Brazil, but also in countries like Ecuador, which has a similar racial ideology where white is beautiful, there's evidence of very strong preference. If people do in vitro fertilization, there's very strong preference for egg donors and sperm donors to be white and blonde. So they're already basically doing eugenics. The doctors participate in this kind of like, oh, let's whiten the kids of these mestizo people to make the nation better. It's already happening in Latin America. So if CRISPR becomes a thing, it's going to become even more widespread. Yeah.
Yeah. So Jenny Ryan, she poses the question, could you talk more about the resistance in the Brazilian plastic surgeon community to plastic surgery for those identifying as transgender?
Yeah. So I remember seeing a gender nonconforming woman sort of coming to one of these public hospitals seeking, she wanted breast implants, and she came with her boyfriend, and she was like, this is what I want. And she just did the line like everybody else. She was following the rules. And the plastic surgeon, the medical residents denied her service and sort of kicked her out. And she made a big scandal. She said, like, this is ridiculous. I have my rights. And her story was interesting because I sort of, I didn't witness that event, but I witnessed the story started spreading throughout hospitals I was doing research in several hospitals, and people would talk about this and laugh at her and be like, can you imagine this, right? Using a sort of an offensive term, wanting to get plastic surgery. I can't believe it, and sort of teaching the medical residents that these people shouldn't be allowed to get surgery, right? So they sort of taught each other. It was very openly transphobic and homophobic medical practice. I talk in the book about how I had to hide because I identify as gay and non-binary, and I had to hide those two things from the plastic surgeons themselves, or I realized they wouldn't give me access, right? And so, yeah, it's a very problematic kind of medical practice. But again, there's very few women, for example, right? It's most people from the elite, right, that have very strong ideas of what gender and race should be for the nation, and they impose that through their practice.
So if they do have these, in quote, standards of how they might react to someone who is transgender, are they setting limits on what everybody else could do? And is there a response not only by the surgeons, but by society around people who go too far?
I find it really interesting because I remember there was a woman who got a facelift in a public hospital, and she was very angry that it wasn't noticeable. And she came back to the surgeon. She was like, nobody can tell that I had a facelift. And he said, that's a really good facelift. It's very subtle. And she was like, no, I want it to be visible because she wanted the symbolic capital that comes with having a plastic surgery in Brazil, while the surgeon wanted to do the more subtle thing, right, so that people wouldn't notice. So there was this interesting kind of dichotomy between what each of them wanted. So yeah, there's interesting ways in which some patients embrace kind of a radical plastic surgery look, right? In fact, among gender nonconforming women, travestis in Brazil, a very, very tiny nose that looks unnaturally small is very, very popular because it's a sign that you have the capital to have purchased the plastic surgery. And because they don't have access to the public hospitals, they bought it in a private clinic. So there's these interesting ways in which what we think of extreme is actually somewhat desirable among certain working class patients, which is really interesting. The surgeons don't like that, right? The surgeons, because they want to produce normative bodies, are specifically try to weed out people that, according to them, are plastic surgery addicts or stuff like that. But there's some scholars that sort of warn us against using that language because they argue that plastic surgeons use that language to their benefit, right? Talking about plastic surgery addiction, for example.
Mm-hmm. And I know that in China and Japan, they do limb lengthening in order to be taller, in order to be more able to function in business, especially with Western clients and things like that. So whenever you think about, so this book came out in 2017, and you've had, as a result, you've also had a number of years to do other research, and you have another book coming out as well. So how has your research changed, and what other things are you looking at related to this topic?
So I have two edited collections coming out this year. One is called Remaking the Human, and it's an edited collection about cosmetic technologies. So I only wrote the introduction, but it's a very interesting collection. I'm interested about different cosmetic enhancement technologies around the world. There's a chapter about Brazil, but there's chapters about Portugal and Mexico and different countries, Colombia, right? Sort of not just about plastic surgery, but hormonal enhancement and Viagra and all these other technologies that people use to transform their bodies. The other edited collection that's coming out in November is called Precarious Democracy, and it's about basically how do we get to Bolsonaro, right? So you're probably all aware that Brazil elected a very right-wing president who is doing a terrible job with COVID because he's a complete COVID denier and hasn't even bought enough vaccines for the country. And so that edit collection is more trying to figure out how did people go from a sort of center-left government of the Workers' Party under the first female president, the first working class president, Lula and Dilma, to Bolsonaro. How did we get there? And that's 17 chapters. I have a chapter on trans activists and how they respond to Bolsonaro. And I'm hoping to eventually write a book about just trans activists. So when I started doing research on this and I realized the gender binary being so important in Brazil, and I began to sort of discover my own identity as someone who's non-binary, I began to get really interested on trans activists. So I've done a lot of interviews with them. I love their work. Most of them mix art with activism because they argue that they can't just change society by doing politics. They actually need to do art to sort of influence how people feel about gender non-conforming identities in Brazil. And their work is just awesome. By the way, tomorrow, quick plug, I'm showing a documentary about Linda Quebrada, one of these trans artivists, as they call themselves, because they're artists and activists. If you want to learn more about this, tomorrow at 5, I'm giving that talk. So that's my new research. The trans activism is my new research, and I love it. It's much more positive. Like this was kind of the plastic surgery was awesome, but was depressing to a certain extent and claustrophobic. And this is a more joyful form of research in a lot of ways. Very different, right? I wanted to write about the people that want to do change and not just, have things stay the same, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to think about the different ways in which people seek change. They seek change through education. They seek change through physical modification. They seek change in their own society and politics and things like that. So, so it looks like we're at 5:30. So let me say thank you so much for talking to us about this book. I'm very excited about the other works that are coming out, and I'm sure everybody else is. So let us all thank you for coming out and spending time and talking to us. And I do not think we have another author on the Hill yet scheduled, but we are working on that. And as soon as we have the next wonderful speaker, we will make that public. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you for presenting today. And I hope everybody has a very pleasant evening.
Thanks for coming, everybody. I appreciate it.